Welcome to the Money Maze podcast. If this is your first time joining us, I'm the host, Simon Brewer. Last week, I was invited to Oslo to host the Grieg Conference, where I interviewed General Sir Patrick Sanders, who was the Chief of the General Staff until this summer. In this interview, he shares his perspectives on the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, assessing his take on the inbound new Trump administration. He also discusses US-China relations and the controversies surrounding the ESG-driven divestment from Western arms companies. Thanks go to Grieg Investor Conference for hosting this discussion. Grieg Investor is an independent investment advisor for institutional investors in Norway, representing over 100 clients. They're part of the Grieg Group, whose roots are in the country's thriving maritime industry. I have to say we got on the first flight out this morning at 7 o'clock out of London and been very excited, and really it's a great honour. You know, I've only been to Oslo once in my life before, you've been more, but first of all, thank you very much for being here, and we hope it's going to be worth your while, because the secret, I'm told, of being a good podcaster is to be no more than 5% of the conversation. Now, my problem is that I talk a lot. My friends say it's not possible, Simon, that you can podcast because you want to answer the question as well as ask it. But in this case, I know what I don't know, which is very important. But I'm going to ask one question to everybody. Has anybody here met personally with Donald Trump? Hands up. Right, so we have the right person. We have the right person here. I was worried. Why don't we start with Donald Trump? You've been in the room with him. How does he view the world right now? And let's maybe start specifically with Russia and Ukraine.
It's quite hard to be able to predict what Trump will do in any given situation because he sends out very mixed signals. And we know that he has succeeded, beyond, I think, everyone's expectations in the US election because he has been focused primarily on domestic issues that really appeal to the electorate. So the economy, immigration, the woke cultural issues, but also because he said that he will put an end to wars rather than starting them. And we all know that he has declared that he can end the Ukrainian war in a day. He and his coterie of advisors are described as realists. I would say that that is magical realism. They're not going to achieve that in a day. But there is also grounds for optimism because he's taken personal ownership of this issue. He said, I will end this war. And by doing that, he's got a stake in it. He's got a stake in an outcome that makes him look like a winner and not look like a loser. And the one thing we can be certain of is that Putin will overplay his hand. His aims when it comes to Ukraine are uncompromising, unbending. His three war aims are the subjugation of Ukraine, and that's not just about territory, it's about being able to control the government in Kyiv and make sure that they are loyal to Moscow. His second aim is the re-establishment of Novorossiya, sort of ancient imperial Russia, which includes lands that now are part of NATO. And his third aim is to dismantle and undermine the Western security order, the Euro-Atlantic security order, and he sees the EU and NATO as existential threats. So it's quite hard to come to terms with someone with those aims. So I think it's very likely that the first set of conversations will result in Trump realizing that there is no deal to be had unless he causes Putin some pain. If he doesn't do that and he gives Putin what he wants, then you end up with Trump owning a strategic defeat in the same way that Biden owned Afghanistan as a defeat.
How does he cause pain to force Putin to adjust his ambitions?
So we know what needs to be done to ensure that you get to a position where you achieve a mutually hurting stalemate. This is a position where both sides realize that there is no profit in pursuing the war any longer. The problem is that we haven't been doing enough to get there. So what we've effectively been doing is extending the timeline of this conflict, but extending the timeline of an inevitable outcome, which is some form of Ukrainian defeat and Russian victory. And what we need to do instead is to change the trajectory of the conflict. And to do that, there are a number of things that we need to do. And this is we, the West. We've got to consider a future where Europe has to take on much more of this burden than the US are. We're capable of it, but we need to change our trajectory now. And very simply, you need to be able to ensure that you're providing air defense protection over Western Ukraine. That might mean deploying Western assets into Western Ukraine in a defensive protective role. It means continuing to supply them with sufficient arms and materiel. And it means investing in the Ukrainian defense industries that are actually doing this better than we are. Let's give them the Storm Shadows. Let's give them the Army Tactical Missile System. Let's give them the long-range precision fires to strike into Russia and the positions to do so. But above all, invest in their own organic capabilities because they don't need to ask for political permission. And they're doing these things. Their industry is doing things better than we are.
Before we leave Russia, you're a soldier. You've been on the battlefield. Take us down to the battlefield level. And this would have been a familiar warfare in some circumstances to Stalin or Churchill's experience of the death count. There was a publication only 2 days ago I read that said 1,500 Russians a day were being injured or killed. Are you surprised by how much stiff resistance and, in fact, in one case, advance Ukraine's been able to mount? And would that, if we didn't have a change of leader, would you have expected any different outcome?
So before I answer the question, we tend to think of what we're seeing in front of us, playing out in front of us in Ukraine as an aberration, something that is ahistorical. In fact, we as a generation have grown up, we're an incredibly lucky generation. We've grown up in the most prosperous and peaceful times in human history. And what we're being reminded of now is that we're seeing a return of history. And historically, war is the norm. We may hate that idea, but war is normal. So in Russian history, between the period 900 and 1900, there are only 25 years of unbroken peace. In English history, in the same period, 56 out of every 100 years, we're at war. And wars are frequent. So peace is the absence of war. It doesn't happen very often. They are long. So we're used to 100-hour wars, 100-day wars. By historical standards, the First and the Second World War were short wars. Wars are extraordinarily destructive. The price of peace is far, far cheaper than the cost of war. And they metastasize, they spread. And this is the historical norm. Now, what we're seeing on the battlefield at the moment is both regressive, but it's also progressive. So the regressive elements are constants in war. The attrition, the suffering, the level of casualties. Russia has now taken over 700,000 casualties. Within the next 6 months, they will have lost, killed or wounded, over 1 million people. These are extraordinary figures. The battlefront is 800 kilometers long. Most of this is being fought, as you see on the TV screens, by people in trenches in a way that is recognizable to what you would have seen in the First World War. But there are also profound differences. So the battlefield is completely transparent. There's nowhere to hide. There are over 1,500 drones over the battlefield every single day. And these are treated as disposable systems. So most of these drones won't succeed in their mission. They may last 2 or 3 missions, so they're constantly being reproduced. Unseen in all of this is a battle of electronic warfare where a drone, in order to penetrate this space, will often experience 2 or 3 new software upgrades a week. So it's a constant process of adaptation. And then the ranges are vastly extended. So we're now seeing units that are capable of engaging out to 25, 30 kilometers, where previously that would have been weapon systems that were held at a much higher echelon. And the really deep strikes are thousands of kilometers.
Or we might come back to some of the investment themes.
And of course, it's being driven by increasingly by algorithms, by data, and by AI.
Right, and we will come back to that now. But nowhere, at least in the last 100 years that I can remember, has seen more regular warfare than the Middle East. Let's turn to the Middle East because, like him or loathe him, under the last Trump presidency, the Abraham Accords were pushed forward and the unthinkable, for many, happened. And some of it happened courtesy of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who I understand then went off to launch a fund and Saudi's MBS put $2 billion into the fund. Is Jared Kushner going to be sent off to try and see if there is a deal to be done? And what do you think is the likely playbook for the Middle East in the next couple of years?
Yeah, and the other bit of credit we should give him is that he put an end to ISIS. And he took Soleimani off the board as well. So Trump is capable of taking executive decisions that can have quite significant strategic consequences. He's not afraid of using force when he needs to. So there's something in that. Again, you've got to step back. So this is an administration which is very, very serious about the competition with China. Depending on who gets selected for which post will dictate how far they tilt that way. But common to all futures and any team he has, they will be much, much more focused on the competition with China and potentially preparing for conflict with China. In order to do that, because the US are no longer have the armed forces that are capable of fighting two wars simultaneously, certainly not against China and Russia, they will want to remove or neutralize distractions, other threats. So if they can find a way of taking Russia off the board, the Russian problem, the Ukraine problem off the board, and the Iranian problem off the board, they will. But how do you do that when the objectives you had in the Middle East are in tension? Because the Israeli Netanyahu's assumption is that he will have the full-throated backing of the US government to pursue policies that essentially reduce the chances of Palestinian survival, let alone the creation of a Palestinian state. And it's very unlikely that you can achieve a grand bargain in the Middle East that does settle the region for a generation or more and potentially finds a way of getting Iran away from the prospects of nuclear proliferation and going nuclear if you haven't resolved the Palestinian issue. Because if you want to achieve normalization, you have to find a way of dealing with the Palestinian question. And so his support for Israel and wanting to achieve normalization is really hard to reconcile. So they've got to decide what their priorities will be.
You've been chief of the General Staff for two successive periods. Iran is, as General Petraeus, who was on the show last year, and I listened to him just this week, said he is the persistent enemy because he wishes the destruction of Israel and he's an enemy of the US. If we think about Iran specifically, what would the US tolerate in terms of actions? And is there any way that this theocracy, which appears to be despised by much of the youth of Iran, can be toppled?
I always think a useful way of thinking about Iran is to draw parallels with Korea, with the Koreas. And this is a little bit like a South Korean population with a North Korean leadership that sits on top of it. So the narrow base, it has a very, very narrow base of support. Elements of that support, that leadership, rather like a cockroach, will prevail in any future. So it's likely that the IRGC will remain part of any future polity in Iran. Iran is in a dangerous position, and it is dangerous because of it, because its national security doctrine, which relied on a combination of a missile threat and proxies to dominate the region and hold Israel at risk, has collapsed as a strategy. There are a range of things it can do to restore deterrence in the region, deterrence of Iran primarily, but also to an extent of the US. And at the most dangerous end, that would involve either withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, probably as a bargaining chip, or going for nuclear breakout. And we know that they can achieve nuclear breakout, so viable warheads, within 2-3 weeks. Delivery systems are different, but once they've crossed that threshold, it becomes very difficult to pull them back. There is an optimistic future out there which leaves open the possibility that Iran could adopt a different foreign security policy. And there might be a very, very narrow landing zone, a window, where you can provide sufficient incentives to Iran in return for not going nuclear, normalizing with Iran, and stopping being a regional spoiler. But it's an extraordinarily small window.
And before we leave it, if you were sitting in Netanyahu's office and you would see that those proxies and the other deterrents had been significantly weakened, you might smell an opportunity for something much bigger. What could Israel do, given that we understand that deep nuclear facilities can't be reached by traditional sort of Israeli planes, etc.?
They can do damage and they can set back the regime, and we should stand back and admire if not the intent, then the execution of the way they took Hezbollah apart. They will have military plans and capabilities that will do far more damage to Iran than Iran expects. This is an existential threat for Israel. But it's very unlikely that they can completely remove the nuclear facilities without US support. And back to what Trump's priorities are, war with Iran is not a priority. So for all that there are some very, very hard right nationalist elements of Netanyahu's government that would like to go after regime change, history shows us that in this region that regime change has unintended consequences and doesn't tend to pan out well.
Whereas in the Cold War, Russia's economic influence was irrelevant to the West, China's is significant. And although it's tilted, when you look at its trade flows, it's tilted. A lot of its trade flows to the global south, and US has become less important. We all know it's a very different equation. It's been called a strategic competitor. It's been called a constant challenge, all sorts of euphemisms for the fact that we have two ideologies that are set against each other. How should we, and I'm going to say we because for the moment we like to think the West is has a relatively united front in many of these issues. How would you advise the West approaches the China dilemma?
So the nature of the competition that we're engaged in, because what's causing this sort of epochal shift that we're in at the moment is a return to a competition. And the nature of that competition is essentially between a liberal West, the democracies, and an axis, an alignment of autocracies, of which China is one. So this rather awful acronym, the CRINCs, so China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, form the core of that. And you could point to them and say that they are an axis in being, rather like the Axis powers, because you've got North Korean soldiers, you've got Iranian weapons, you've got Chinese material and political support, and Russians all operating alongside each other in Ukraine. But China's approach, China's aims are different to those others. And what China is seeking to do is not to cause the world to burn in the way that Kim Jong-un or Putin might do, but simply to change the world order in a way that it suits it, through a process of transactional and it's sort of insidious constructivism. So the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, all of these initiatives that are increasingly capturing, either through an attraction to autocracy as a model or through investment, more and more of the global south. So recognize the nature of the competition that we're in. Xi, and it is Xi that we're dealing with, is one of a triumvirate of great Chinese leaders. So the narrative goes, Mao made China stand up, Deng made China rich, and Xi is making China strong. And he seeks nothing less than being the regional hegemon in the area, hence what he's doing in the South China Sea with the 10-dashed line, and being a global power. And the risk is that we fall into this idea of the Thucydides trap, where a rising power and a declining power inevitably clash, and it leads to war. And the flashpoints around that will be the South China Sea or Taiwan. There is no guarantee that does not need to happen. But at the moment, what concerns Xi is, first of all, that he doesn't want to repeat the mistakes of Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet era, because he can see the Communist Party, it sits on it's fragile, it's narrow, the Chinese economy, and a conviction, and it's hard to describe him as wrong when you listen to what some of Trump's acolytes have said, that the United States and the West are opposed to the rise of China in any and all circumstances. And that sets us up for a competition. So taking the long view, not creating flashpoints and confrontations, adopting a process of strategic ambiguity over issues like Taiwan is the best course to navigate through what is approaching to be a very, very dangerous period between about 2027 and 2040. Those sort of 15 years to 2 decades is where the maximum danger is. And let's not pick a fight unnecessarily.
So if we told about this list of problems which exist geopolitically, and we'd been away for 3 years on a desert island. We came and had been given this list, and then we'd said, right, you all have you tell us where the S&P 500 is, and then we put it up, and you all go, hang on a second, what am I missing? Because, of course, the thing is that we can have all of these geopolitical worries, which are highly legitimate, and it was Scott Bessent, who might become the Treasury Secretary under Trump, who's Key Square Capital, he was George Soros' CIO. He said the other day, very nice, if you'd shown me the papers from last month, I'm not sure I would have made the right portfolio decision. Because it is so hard, because there are so many variables. Now, within all the stuff we're talking about, we know that war is an agent for technological change. Maybe just talk for a few minutes about where some of these opportunities are emerging, thinking from an investment standpoint. And you said to me something quite interesting earlier on. You said, as the US departs, so gaps are being created. Let's talk about where some of those gaps are and how they might be filled and by whom.
Yeah, so the bad news first, which is get used to this, because this is only going to get worse. And one of the consequences of Trump's election is that Europe, if it wants to take some ownership of its own safety and its own prosperity, is going to have to spend more on defense. And it's going to have to spend it smarter by being much more collaborative as opposed to competitive with its industrial base. The good news is we have the wherewithal to do it. We're just lacking the leadership and the statecraft to make it happen. Trump could be the spur that makes that happen. So what I meant was, when you look at some of the things that Trump has said and his team have said, it points to where the space they're going to vacate. So starting with technology, they're going to be all in on giving tech companies a free rein. So a complete absence, not light touch regulation, but almost deregulation. That's what Musk is expecting for the price of his support. And that means that they will follow the science when it comes to things like artificial intelligence and biotech. The space they're going to vacate is the most important space of all, which is safety and testing of AI. Because I think possibly within this decade, and definitely in the 2030s, we will reach artificial general intelligence, AGI, and from that very quickly to artificial superintelligence. So we're going to find ourselves as a species having to coexist with entities that are super intelligent. And the scientists may not care about this, but we will, and our voters will, and they will want to have the reassurance that these AIs are understood, have been tested, and have some safety features. So there is a whole sector around AI safety and AI testing, which the US won't pursue, which Europe can. And for a UK parochial perspective, we're the third leading power in the world when it comes to AI. We've got the wherewithal to do it, and we could do it with partners.
Yes, I think it was observed to me on one of the interviews that if you think about how the world is approaching AI, Europe wants to regulate it. China is not going to allow anybody to be more powerful than the PRC, and in the US it's the Wild West. And, of course, that's seen in valuations, that's seen where the money has been flowing, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, some interesting opportunities.
Overregulation is not the answer.
Yeah.
Testing and safety is the way to get to safe AI.
And, of course, the other gap is a very marked divergence towards the energy transition. Yeah. And I think everyone in the room is more than aware, and with probably some great head scratching about the derating of the alternatives and sort of, the carbon plays that, are there. I think let's just talk a little bit about what you see. And I know you're not an investor, but you see things very strategically in a way that, most of us don't. Where might those gaps be?
So I think you've pointed to them. It's possible that the initiatives that Biden's administration put in the US will become self-sustaining. So there is enough momentum in energy transition in that sector in the US that they carry on regardless. But drill, baby, drill is not a rallying cry that most of us would want to rally around, but the energy companies will. And at the moment, China is sort of leading on some of the green technologies. I think there is space for being created by the US, for the West, for Europe to be able to fill that sector. I also think that when you think in terms of geography, we've been saying that this is the African century for probably 2 or 3 decades now, but at some point that is going to be true. The raw materials, the opportunities for labour when there are labour shortages elsewhere, the prospects for potentially onshoring manufacturing, certainly the prospects for onshoring mineral exploitation, are going to make Africa more and more important. And if nothing else, it'll be a security concern. At the moment, we are kind of ceding ground to China and to an extent to Russia in Africa, but that will have a half-life. And I think that half-life is quite short. And what it is that African countries will look to from the West will be long-term investments that will bear fruit. Some of that is just in good governance, because that's a good bet for everybody. But a lot of it is in helping them with energy transition. And the US won't be there.
So I want to be a little bit provocative since we're sitting here in Norway. But if you were sitting in the Donald Trump chair and you looked around the world and you would go, oh, there's the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world sitting there in Norway. And you know what? They've just bought 52 F-35s. They are buying mechanisms to deploy weapons. They're buying all sorts of kit and equipment. But the Norwegian investment fund is not allowed to buy arms companies and is not allowed to buy, therefore, Northrop Grumman or Boeing. Or wouldn't you think that seems odd and I may want to act?
I mean, I think it's immoral. And when I go further than inconsistent, I think it's absolutely immoral that a fund the scale of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund does not invest in the things that will keep us safe, because we are a defensive alliance. All we are interested in is trying to protect close to 1 billion people that sit under NATO, led by a Norwegian up until recently and done immensely skillfully as well. So if we are serious about carrying the burden or being prepared to carry the burden for European security, and Norway knows more acutely than most countries the risks of living next to Russia and what Russian historical trends have been, then it should be investing initially in some US companies because we're going to need to pay the rent to keep the US engaged in NATO, but increasingly to make ourselves more sovereign and more independent.
Well, I know Nicolai Tang's not here today because he and I had an exchange. He was a guest 3 years ago, and we have conversations, and he's a very, very big fan. He did create a podcast that had a lot of similarities with the one that we built, so I'll take it as a great compliment that he has, and I am a regular listener every week to his...
His questions are shorter than yours.
His questions are shorter. On that note, it's time to wrap up. Thank you, General Sir Patrick Sanders, for sharing your insights on today's world, whose flashpoints grow more unpredictable by the day. You have offered us some fascinating perspectives on the conflicts around us and, very importantly, highlighted the inconsistency of those who want NATO protection with its nuclear capabilities, yet don't appear willing to invest in the companies who allow such capabilities to be built. Thank you. All content on the Money Maze podcast is for your general information and use only, and is not intended to address your particular requirements. In particular, the content does not constitute any form of advice, recommendation, representation, endorsement, or arrangement, and is not intended to be relied upon by users in making any specific investment or other decisions. Guests and presenters may have positions in any of the investments discussed.